Thank you very much, Rochelle, for that warm introduction and welcome. And I love that exercise, as Rochelle knows from yesterday, where we had to extend it a little bit. But the technology is, I think, going with us. Oh, do I have a flicker or do I just do?
No, just.
Yeah, okay. So yes, very comfortable looking at how we can get beyond our comfort zones. And I also just want to say thanks to Sports and Rec Victoria, thanks to Outdoors Victoria and the Royal Botanical Gardens for making this happen. So I want to pick up on that invitation that we all took up so enthusiastically about kind of looking at our own childhoods and thinking about what it's like to grow up and what it's like to grow up when we were growing up and what it's like to grow up today. So next slide, please. I think one of the things about childhood that we sometimes kind of forget or underplay is that, amongst other things, it's a kind of journey. And that at the start of that journey, children are completely dependent upon grown-ups for them meeting their most basic needs. But then as children grow up, which they have a tendency to do, they gradually get better at stuff, all sorts of stuff. So what, in a nutshell, childhood is a kind of transfer of risk management responsibility from adults to children. Okay, and that transfer it happens best when it happens gradually. Yeah, when you never make the steps too big, and then hopefully at some point what you end up with is somebody who is, confident, capable, resilient, engaged, just as we saw with Rochelle a minute ago. So I think we lose sight of that process, I think, when we're thinking about childhood. And when it comes to thinking about our own childhoods and how it might compare with children today, I mean, I'm guessing maybe the nostalgia bell was ringing a bit when we were doing that exercise, and you might be thinking, well, yeah, but the world is different today, Well, yes, it is. Next slide, please, Andrea. This map, which I use all the time, I probably used when I was last here in Melbourne, and when I first came to Melbourne 12, 15 years ago. What this map shows you is what you might call the roaming range, yeah, or the home territory of 4 8-year-old children. But they're 4 children who are in 4 generations of the same family, who all grew up in the same city. And so that big red blob that you can see that takes up most of the map, that is the roaming range of the great-grandfather in this family. He could go 6 miles, 10k, across the city on his own. And then you can see how the circles shrink, and then just look at the yellow dot, that yellow dot at the top there. That is the home territory of the son in this family, just a few years ago now. So he's allowed to go to the end of his street. In fact, that's probably more of a kind of right to roam than most 8-year-olds get, certainly in the UK, I suspect here in Australia as well. So what this sort of vignette, this case study illustrates beautifully is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And I think it's an underexplored but profound shift in children's lives. And it's the start, I think, it's the right starting point for our conversations and our thinking about children today. Because yes, you can see this difference and this change. By the way, this is happening all over the world, boys and girls, all social and cultural groups. And I'm not saying that our job here is to kind of turn the clock back or that there was some golden age to grow up. But one thing I am saying is that children today have this same appetite for adventure and experience. Children want to get to grips with the world around them, the world as they find it. Okay, so just a little note, maybe that's partly the explanation of why kids do such scary things online these days. It's not as easy to kind of test your boundaries in the real world as it used to be. So where does it happen? It happens online. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about recreation and play spaces, but just a very quick, to pointer back to yesterday's talk, and those of you who didn't see me, I think it's going to be online, is that right, Andrea?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I just wanted to kind of, again, pull up another takeaway from that map yesterday, that I think a good childhood and a good place for children, a good neighbourhood for children is one where, yes, you've got lots of places to go and meet and play and do sport and have fun, but it's also easy to get around. And so that child mobility aspect is a part of the piece. I'm not going to talk too much more about that today, but I wanted to plant it in your mind. It's not enough if we want children to have the best opportunities to kind of gradually expand their horizons. It's not enough to just create different kinds of children's reservations. Okay, next slide. Here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about children's freedoms, which I've already done, play in public space, playgrounds and playground design, and then a bit about managing risk, including a sort of quite exciting new development in the world of risk management. I know that sounds kind of boring, but I think it's actually really exciting. So one of my tasks this morning is to make risk management fun. But perhaps on a slightly more serious note, I want to look at some of the facts, okay? Some of the facts, particularly about playgrounds, because playgrounds is kind of what got me interested in this topic in the first place. So I want you to just kind of ponder in your own head for a second or two how dangerous playgrounds are. Like, are playgrounds dangerous places? Do kids have lots of accidents in playgrounds? Next slide, please. Newsflash, playgrounds are incredibly safe. Next. There you go. So this is a ranked order of leisure activities. So this is per hour. So it's like a like-for-like comparison of different leisure activities. I don't know if you can read this, but if you really want your child to get injured, let them play rugby. Okay, well, I'm guessing footy here. Or hockey, I hear. Hockey, yeah, hockey's up there. So there's playgrounds down the list. About 1/50th of the accident rate. Slightly less dangerous than sailing, slightly more dangerous than fishing. Yeah? Yes, children do sometimes have accidents on playgrounds, but they are not and never have been dangerous places for children to play. Yes, next. I want to say a word or two about the claims culture. These are slightly old figures, but again, some more figures. Figures help. I'm a numbers person. So this is some statistics from a document I'm going to refer to a little bit more later on from Play Australia. Risk getting the balance right. Shows you some rates of claims over a 7-year period for 2 states and territories. Yes, there have been some claims. Is that an epidemic of claims? 26 over 7 years? It may have changed. We might talk about that in the Q&A. But I'm going to suggest to you that is, let's keep that risk in proportion. And yes, we need to manage that risk as we do others. But let's not use this as an excuse for poor practice and boring places and activities. Next slide. I just want to say a word about parents. Parents get a bad rap today, I think, and maybe I don't know. There's a kind of story about parents that goes, parents today, they're just all so paranoid. They're wrapping their kids in cotton wool or bubble wrap, and all of this loss of experiences and that shrinking horizons. It's all down to parents. Okay, I think it's more complicated than that. But when we think about parents, I'm a parent myself. I'm sure there are parents in the room. I think it's fair to say parents are on a kind of spectrum when it comes to their attitude and their kind of, if you like, their appetite for risk on behalf of their children. So how do they feel about children's safety? So let's unpack that a bit. So at one end of this spectrum, this parental spectrum, you might know parents, I don't know, you might even be a parent who is in the market for this product. Knee pads for toddlers, to mitigate the risk of injury on flooring. I'm being a little bit flippant, but I hope we mostly agree that's a bit extreme. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there are some parents whose approach to safety, does leave a little bit to be desired. Okay, and again, there may be a story behind that, but we probably have words with parents at that end of the spectrum as well. But most parents, I think, are somewhere in the middle. And that's really important to remember. And so it's not all parents who are scared and vocal and anxious. Some are. In fact, I suspect it's a minority. But one of the problems is, particularly with services and settings, is that you can get this sort of anxious and vocal minority at this end, And that's the parent who comes along and says, why have you put that in the playground? It's way too dangerous. Or why are you doing this in your early childhood setting? My child's going to get hurt. And we sort of, again, partly because of those anxieties about litigation or whatever, settings and services and councils feel under pressure to, stop that thing or take that structure out. And what happens then? The majority of parents and children lose out from that experience, okay? So one of the things I'm sort of leaving for you to ponder is how do you address and engage with those anxious and vocal parents without letting them have a veto, right? Okay, that's enough about parents for now. I want to move on to public space. And I think it's helpful to sort of have a sort of typology of public spaces. As I've already hinted, there's more to children's spatial lives than playgrounds. Okay, so let's just have a really quick schematic overview of public space. We have streets, the most common and the biggest quantity of space in any town or city where we can go as the public is a street. Second, civic spaces, squares, malls. I'm using public in a sort of slightly extended sense, but hard spaces. Third, green space, parks, reserves, nature areas. And then fourth, playgrounds in the formal sense of the word. Some of them can be quite green, but I think that's a good thing, but some maybe not that green. They might be quite hard spaces. But then the final take is where is it okay, where might it be okay for kids to play? That's this dotted line here. I think we should be aiming for creating a pattern of playable spaces that covers all of these typologies. Why can't children play in malls? Why can't they play in some streets? Why can't they play in some nature areas? Let's really think beyond the playground when we're thinking about creating spaces where children can play. But let's talk a little bit more about public space. I think there are kind of three basic things that come together to make a place playable and come alive with play. So one is location, really important. Kids want to be with other kids. Actually, humans, generally speaking, want to be with other humans. We're a social species. So that's important. Places where we can stay and linger and where it's okay and it's kind of comfortable to stay. Second point. And then this a slightly jargon word, the landscape architects in the room might be familiar with it, affordances. So these are physical features of a space which invite playful interactions or invite a kind of fun stuff. So here is one of the most playful places I've ever visited in my entire life. It's a square in Bilbao in northern Spain. It's a public space. There's public seating. It's not just got cafe seating, so anybody can come in here, they can sit, they don't have to buy a coffee. And when I was there on a Friday night, it was unbelievably buzzy. Around 7, 8 o'clock, the younger kids would be running around, boys would be playing football in huge numbers. Then at some point, and because it was Spain, it was probably like 11:30, 12 o'clock, the little ones would start to drift away, and the tweens and teens would come in and start to hang out, and they do what teens do, and at this point, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, Heelys were a thing. Do people remember Heelys? Like trainers with wheels in them. My daughter, actually it must have been a bit longer ago than that, because my daughter had some, I want to say 15 years. Actually, they're really good fun. I'm kind of sad. Back in, brilliant. No doubt the hospital wards are seeing. But that's, in a way, one of my points is this. I don't have this quote in the slide deck, but Adam Bienenstock, who's been over here in Australia, who's a Canadian landscape architect, he talks about we need to remember the difference between a learning injury and a catastrophic injury. And that, I think that's a really good sort of pithy way of getting at why I don't think it's a problem if more kids are going to hospital with Healy injuries. It's not fun, but let's kind of see the bigger picture. So that's my kind of 3-point checklist for a playful public space. But let's talk a bit more about playgrounds. Now, I don't think there is a single recipe or formula for a great playground. I think it's a great playground. It's a little bit like a great restaurant, right? There isn't just a kind of checklist or a recipe. There's flavours and varieties. There's different scales. There's different audiences. But for me, that's some of what I'm looking for in a playground is in this list. I'm not going to speak through it all, but you'll notice risk and challenge is one of them. I think children do want to be able to sort of test themselves and to get that thrill, that sort of butterfly in the stomach feeling of getting into a situation where they're having to figure out what to do, or they're just, the heart starts racing because they're a bit high, or they're going a bit fast, or they're a bit hidden. I know that's what we're going to talk about some more, so let's remember that. Before I move on to the kind of nitty-gritty of risk, I want to just share briefly some findings from a really big American study. This is an observational study of playgrounds. And actually, there's a lot of parallels with a study that we heard about yesterday, or set of studies from Jenny Veach and her colleagues here in Australia. Similar observational study of some Victoria playgrounds. But in essence, you got huge study, government funded, 60 playgrounds. What are the levels of use? What are the patterns of use? How do they match up to the different features in a playground? And that's a flavour of some of the playgrounds that were part of this study. So, again, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I did just want to flag out the single biggest influencing factor on numbers of people visiting playgrounds is its location. I mean, when you say it, it's kind of obvious, I hope, but it's really big. Like, it's a really big influence. You're 6 times more likely to visit a playground if it's nearby than if it's far away. Right, so we really need to start thinking spatially more when we're thinking about creating play spaces. But the next finding from this big study is, innovative design matters. So this, to unpack it a little bit, they were comparing, I'm going to use a technical word, boring playgrounds with exciting and innovative playgrounds. And what they found was that the innovative playgrounds, the ones that weren't just, plastic fantastics, post and platform structures, those had 2.5 times more users and 3 times as much of the physical activity that we want to see. So a clear takeaway about the value of innovative design. And that's not just about risk, but it is partly, I think, a matter of risk. And then some of the conclusions from the lead authors. Megan Talarowski is one of the people involved in this study. She's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And she's a kind of pro. She talks about risk forward. I think that's quite a nice phrase. Risk forward designs. And that's her shopping list of things that she wants to see more of in playgrounds. And you can see quite a lot of that speaks to this appetite for thrills and excitement. Okay, let's move on to the nitty-gritty of risk. I don't know, is our work safe person in the room? Yes, great. This is the point where I say, yes, really good to have you. This is the point where I say, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm going to ask you to sign a waiver to that effect before you leave at the end of the day. But my understanding of the basic law here in Australia around the duty of care is that it's pretty similar to the laws in my own country, which is that you have a duty to take kind of reasonable steps. Yeah, I think the exact phrase is reasonable practicability. Correct. To safeguard users and employees of your facilities, right? Reasonableness is the goal, right? So if anyone is asking you to do something that goes beyond what is reasonable, I would say they are being unreasonable, right? So the goal isn't the elimination of risk, right? The goal isn't giving people a guarantee that no injury will ever happen in a place. The goal is to be reasonable and then to show reasonableness. And that's, I hope we're on firm ground there.
Nice.
Reasonable practicability. I know there's a discussion about the difference between reasonable practicability and reasonableness. To me, that sounds a slightly... Okay, we might talk later about that. But here's so that's a generic view, but I'm going to home in a bit on playgrounds and leisure now. And I'm going to suggest that there are some differences between a workplace environment and a leisure or environment and playground. And the difference is this. In a nutshell, in a workplace, risk is bad, right? You don't want stuff that can hurt you in a workplace so far as possible. You really want to, it's a risk reduction model, right? And that, I hope that makes sense, right? In a factory, you, as far as possible, you just want to make sure that things in that factory cannot hurt people. But in a playground, things are different. As we've just been talking about, a degree of risk is actually a benefit, right? If you try and remove all the risk, you create a completely dull, sterile and boring place for children. So in fact, what we're in the game of doing is balancing risks against benefits. In other words, doing risk-benefit assessments, sometimes known as benefit-risk assessments. Quick show of hands, who's heard of that phrase, risk-benefit assessment? Great, most of you, brilliant. That's good because about 10, 12 years ago I was over flying the flag for this approach, and I'm very glad to hear that it at least the concept has been spreading. But it's really this insight about playgrounds that has led to some quite profound changes. Certainly where I'm coming from, the UK, this is what playgrounds used to look like when I was bringing up my daughter, right? This is my local big playground in my part of London. Next slide. This is now one of the local playgrounds. It's actually a little bit further away, and it is in the Olympic Park, but it is an unsupervised public playground, and it really is pretty out there. I took Mike Hewson, designer of Rocks on Wheels, which I'm going to see after this event. Anybody wants to come with me to go and see Rocks on Wheels, you'd be very welcome to accompany me. And when I took him to, can you go back, Andrew, is that right? To Tumbling Bay Playground, it blew his mind. So I'm thinking, yeah, I'll take that. And part of what's underpinned the design and the thinking around this playground is precisely a kind of risk-benefit approach. It's close to my heart, I should declare an interest. I was involved in setting the brief for this playground and selecting the design team and so on. Okay, so there are many ways that you can do a benefit risk assessment in the same way that there are many ways that you can do a risk assessment. A few years ago, these were the steps that our own version of WorkSafe, so this is the Health and Safety Executive, advised for doing a risk assessment. 5 steps to risk assessment they used to talk about. There they are. Now, if you wanted to tweak this and turn it into a risk-benefit assessment, it's not that different. In fact, there are just 2 differences. The first difference is that you start with identifying the benefits, right? Let's take a playground. What are the good things that you want to happen in a playground? Yeah? What kind of offers and experiences do you want children to have? And then the second difference is that when you come to that judgment point, the benefits weighing up, evaluating and coming up with a decision, you're not just focusing on the risks, you're also keeping in mind those benefits. And how do you pull that together in a holistic judgment? So it's a game-changing move, but procedurally, it's not that different. So yeah, you've had this idea, can I say, taken it, appropriated it, Kieran, from the UK, incorporated it into Australian thinking around playground design. That's it's a good tool, right? So it's in your authoritative industry guidance as part of this report or document. Next slide. Some key standards bodies around the world have, to different extents, started including reference to risk-benefit or benefit-risk in various documents. And the key one I'm going to talk about is a new global standard that specifically focuses on risk-benefit in leisure and recreation. But before we get to that, let's have a think about what are standards, okay? They're guidance, right? They are not in themselves written into legislation. I'm looking at WorkSafe again. I'm hoping that there's a nod. They're drawn up typically by industry, maybe with some outside. They're backed by a standards body like Standards Australia. They codify what's seen as best practice, but sometimes there's a debate to be had about what actually is best practice. As I've said, they're not a legal requirement, but they are very often taken into account in legal cases, both criminal cases, which are incredibly rare in playgrounds. I'd be surprised if there had been any in Australia. There's probably been 2 or 3 in 25, 30 years in the UK, but also much more, likely in civil litigation. So that's where they have that kind of benchmark role. And typically, so you've got standard 4685 here in Australia for playgrounds. In the UK, we use a European standard. Even though we've said goodbye to the EU, we haven't said goodbye to CEN, which is probably a good thing. So we have CEN 1176. They're kind of ultimately checklists, right? You kind of work through lots of technical stuff about fall heights and finger traps and head traps and fall distances, and they're quite technical engineering documents. And they're, I don't know how long the Australian ones, but if you piled up the UK ones, there's like 12, 15.
Our standard is verbatim for the CEN standard. Except we've got an appendix in part 1. For
Okay.
Australian conditions.
Right.
That's a new standard, that one, part 1. Our part 1 is exactly the same as your part 1.
There you go. So, but still, there's a lot of it.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's set in April.
Yeah. So the standard I'm going to talk about is ISO 4980:2023. And look, that's the gloriously inspiring front cover of this standard. I kind of wish the standards bodies could be a bit more creative with their documents. But anyway, it's called Benefit Risk Assessment for Sports and Recreation Facilities, Activities and Equipment. And that includes playgrounds, and I'll say more. But this is a kind of different type of standard. This is a process standard. So it's saying what are the features of a good risk management process in this sector. And it's not that long. It's like 30 pages. It's not a very fun read, but it is quite short. And I'm just going to pull out some of the key quotes. So I've read it, so you don't have to. Yes, there is an expectation that the user is making an implicit trade-off between the benefits and the inherent risks. Kind of obvious, isn't it? Appetite for risk expressed in all sorts of ways. Next one. Participation in sport and recreation involves exposure to risk, which is not necessarily a bad thing and can be a benefit to the public good. There's a heap of stuff around the developmental benefits for children of engaging with risk and uncertainty, which I'm not going to talk about this morning, because honestly, the literature is huge now, around children's physical activity, around their emotional health and well-being, learning resilience, learning how to deal with risky situations, all of that. Next slide. Even in the case of children's play provision, it is widely recognised that children seek risky situations. And this is kind of the most important one. Different approaches can be used to compare and weigh up risk and benefits. Sometimes qualitative procedures reliant upon competent judgment are likely to be deployed. In other words, this is quite a flexible model. There are some situations where you might need to do some technical things, but there are other situations where you kind of think carefully and reasonably about what could go wrong. You think carefully and reasonably about what you want to happen that's good, and you figure out a way of balancing those up. And there's no requirement or expectation that you put in numbers or use scoring systems. So you might want to do that, but it's not expected in this document. So I'm going to talk about one approach to risk-benefit assessment. This is the flow chart. Like I say, it's take you a little bit of time to figure it, but in essence, it's what I've said earlier. You have a process to think about the benefits on one side. You have a process to think about the risks. You bring that analysis together, and you come up with a decision, and then you kind of follow it through and check it, and you revisit it. So the version of risk-benefit assessment that I've probably promoted here in Australia on all my previous visits, I'm very pleased to say it is one of the annexes to this guidance. So this is one version, and you could say it's a narrative version of risk-benefit assessment. You start thinking about the benefits. What are the good things you want to happen? Then you think about the risks, the things that could go wrong. Sometimes you might need to get some technical input about what those risks might be. If you're building a complicated structure, you'll want to get an engineer in to tell you whether it's going to support the weight of the children or offer any hidden hazards. Then you think about local factors. What about this location or this user group of children that might be, or this site that might be relevant? You might also, especially if you're doing something innovative or that's going beyond the standards and so on, you might want to look at what have other people done, precedents and comparisons. Then you make a judgment and you carry it out and you review it. Okay, so it's a narrative approach. It's kind of saying what you do and then doing what you say. That as well. So there you are. That's the annex. I do want to give a quick hat tip to this guy, David Ball, who's a long-standing collaborator of mine. He was on this committee that set this up. I mean, I wasn't, thankfully. Life's too short, I think, for most of us to get involved in developing standards. He was, the fact that this standard ended up where it is a lot down to David's tenacity, ability to persuade, and understanding of the evidence and the arguments. He's a professor of risk management, in case you weren't aware. So, and there's one more standard I want you to know about, which I must say I'm not so familiar with, but it's going in the same direction. This is a standard for playground inspectors. Are there any playground inspectors in the room? No? Okay. But probably people who work with them. So there is a new playground inspection standard that expects playground people, right, that one of the knowledge bases that playground inspection people should have is about child development and children's play and the benefits. So that is also a big deal because it's going to help with making those more balanced and proportionate judgments. Now, I am conscious of time, so I'm going to skip the next very brief case study about, this is, in brief, the story here is quirky public space feature, bit risky. In order to figure out how to make it safer, the duty holders carried out a risk-benefit assessment. So they didn't remove it once they realised it was a bit iffy. They kept it. It's non-compliant with the standard. It was non-compliant. It still is non-compliant. But everybody who needed to, including the lawyers, signed up to the new structure, which is still non-compliant. So one last slide about this ISO. I think it's a game-changing move. You've now got all of you in the room who want to do creative approaches that expand children's opportunities for engaging with risk and uncertainty, have got this process to help you think through a proportionate and balanced way to do it. You didn't used to have that in quite this credible form. It's not perfect, but it's very flexible, and over time I think we'll see it make a real difference. So this is my takeaway message. It goes back to what Rochelle was doing. This is a message, it's one of those internet memes about, it's true of children, but I'm hoping you'll see and you'll ponder about how true it is of you, that you will do great things for children if you get outside of your comfort zones. Thank you very much.